Welcome to the Connected Enterprise Podcast. This is Carl Lewis, your host from Vision33. And my guest today is my good friend and colleague, David Strausser. David, like I do with every guest, please tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you're doing today.
Okay, first, hey, Carl, thank you so much for having me on. It's honor. I love the show. It's great. So I appreciate being on and being able to tell your audience who I am. For people that don't know me, I am David Strausser. I'm a Forbes.com contributor as a member of the Forbes Biz Dev Council. And outside of that, I do kind of have two jobs. I'm the general manager of the Northeast region for Vision33, where I love helping businesses break through bottlenecks, preventing growth with SAP Business One and Sage Intacct. It's, really time for businesses to automate and to digitally transform. So if you need that stuff, I'm your guy. That's my day job. Now my night gig, that's pretty sweet, Carl, okay? That's where I am the best kept secret in the whole business world. We're more of a secret than KFC's 11 herb and spices. That's my podcast, Shark Bite Biz. That's where you and me, Carl, we belong to the podcast fraternity.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the same crazy guys. Absolutely.
Oh yeah,
hey, David. The reason that I wanted to speak to you today is because you're one of the individuals I know that has worked internationally, and now over the last 2 or 3 years, you've kind of gone from the West Coast of the U.S. to the East Coast of the U.S. So you bring a lot of, call it, cultural awareness to your business acumen. So I'm wondering, tell us how you got to Mexico. And as you're working there, what you would say if you were an American going there today with no background, what you should look out for in the Mexican business climate.
Right. So it was about 20 years ago, roughly. I mean, November would be 20 years that I left coal country, Pennsylvania, small city called Pottsville. It's the home of Yuengling beer, as I tell you every time we're together drinking a Yuengling. But I left there. It's a small town, small city. It's good, but it just wasn't for me. I needed to be somewhere bigger, a bigger city, and I really wanted to be international. So I turned 18 6 months in, and I was going to go to London. My buddy, you got to remember, this is literally, 2001. So it wasn't before the internet, but it was like before major search engines and being able to search things easy. It was still a little bit of a pain. And it's kind of funny because my buddy who ended up moving with me to Mexico, he was like, no, don't go to London. We're going to go down to Tijuana. And I'm like, Tijuana? And he's like, why? And basically he made me watch the movie Born in East LA. And after that movie, we're both, okay, yep, we're moving to Tijuana because it was just so funny with who was it, Cheech in that movie. And it was just great. We were young and dumb. But then we were also thinking more strategically too, that we wanted to live in an area that was close enough that, we were scared. We didn't know September 11th just happened. What if we wanted to go back home, or we needed to go back home or whatever to the US? We wanted to be someplace that was close to the United States. And little did we know at the time that most people don't realize this. They know that Tijuana and San Diego are on the border to each other, but I don't think most people realize exactly how close they are. I mean, take a city, any major US city, Philadelphia, New York, whatever, put a fence in the middle of the city, and that is literally going to be Tijuana on the south side of that fence and San Diego on the northern side of the fence. I mean, It is one big metropolitan that is divided by well, I guess now a physical barrier, but, divided by an international boundary. And it is one of the most, I think it's one of the most interesting places on the earth that I've ever been to, because you just have this weird melting of culture, I'd say within 10 miles of the border at each side. And it's really innovative, because it's like you get the best of Mexico and you get the best of the US on either side of the border. And when we ended up moving down, well, we went down on vacation and we were like, hey, if we like it, we're going to stay here. We loved it. So we ended up staying there. And for about 15 years, roughly, I lived and or worked in Mexico. I mean, there was a point that I lived in San Diego, but was commuting to Mexico to work every single day. And it's just because, it's one of those things. I didn't really plan on life being this way. I took the hard path, but I took the hard path willingly, and it was just happenstance. I followed the opportunities I had. It was easy at some points, a lot of highlights, and then there was also low points. I mean, for my first couple years as a young adult, I lived in a Tijuana ghetto, and I think that experience gave me a very unique perspective on life, on the world. And I'm not unique in that either. I get a lot of people on my Shark Bite Biz podcast that always tell us about how, oh, I traveled to Brazil or Peru or, Africa or wherever it may be. And maybe they lived there for a short amount of time. And it really, really impacted them and their future ventures. And I would say, me getting down there, living in that area that I did live in, really just gave me a different twist on life. I mean, I think it really helped me understand the Mexican culture to a degree that I wouldn't have understood if I just stayed in the tourist zones.
Absolutely. So with that, 15 years of experience, that's a lot. And you're right about that particular border. It seems like, hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands at least, go across that border every day back and forth to work and live.
That's one thing people don't realize, that there is a very, very large American presence down there in Baja California. And when I say American, I'm not just talking about, a white guy like me from rural Pennsylvania that moved down there and works in San Diego and brings the dollars down to Mexico, but you have a lot of Mexican Americans too. For example, my son, now he lives up here, but him being a Mexican American, Francisco, that live down there, work up and do the same thing. And there's a huge presence. I mean, you're talking probably 100,000 more Americans that live down there and get their income from north of the border.
Yeah, I totally believe that. So what are three things you could tell us about, when you were doing business in Mexico that are kind of unique to, the Mexican culture and that sort of border life that you might not find someplace else in the US?
There are so many things unique about Tijuana. It was culture shock to the highest degree when I first went. But in terms of business, there's a couple different things down there that are unique. First is obviously the tax system. Anybody that's done work in Mexico, they may have heard about this. But I mean, like if you're doing a receipt that's going to be for business purposes in Mexico, I mean, it's got to have like a QR code on it. And usually attached to that QR code, you're going to have what's called like an RFC. And RFC is kind of like a federal tax ID, but for businesses down in Mexico. And I actually have RFC, and I have a lot of the QR codes because you have to do it all digitally. And I always thought that was odd because of the fact that if you look how Mexico is, compared to the wealth and the tech and the knowledge and, just, I guess you could say the advancement that we have in the United States. I mean, you wouldn't expect that, wow, they digitally transformed their whole tax system. And remember, they have people that are in extreme poverty. Maybe they just own a small little taco cart that they put in the corner, and that's a source of their living. And yet they got to do all taxes digitally with these digital QR codes for every little transaction to make it legal. It was a rough start, but the government was like, hey, this is the way. If you can't do it, well, then guess you're going to have to pay more taxes because you don't get the write-offs, and really twisted the people. And I found that to be surprising, I guess you could say, compared to the United States, because again, you look at where we are superior in different areas versus Mexico as a whole, and we don't have really any of that up here. I mean, it's still a lot of people that do a pen and paper Excel sheets.
Yeah.
So that was one of the biggest differences that I've seen. Have you heard about that at all with the QR codes?
I have, and it's one of the things that fascinates me because it makes me wonder, is it because, of their stronger commitment to technology when it comes to, sort of call it government oversight, or is it our whole pushback against government oversight, that causes that sort of chasm between the two that you wouldn't expect?
Right. And that's a thing. I mean, you look at a place like Mexico, and there was a lot of confusion. I lived down there and worked down there, and I had my own business when this stuff was rolling out. And it was tough. It was really, really hard in the beginning because it was like, oh my God, it's like you go to take a client. Let's just say I take Carl, and Carl's my client, and I take him for lunch at a restaurant down there in Tijuana. And you can write that off, or I think they let you write 50% off. I forget off the top of my head, but you can write it off, but then you've got to request the code, the tax paper. So at that time, then, you had to, okay, I need a tax code, and you pretty much have to give your email address to the cashier, who puts it in the computer then, and they'll be like, okay, in 48 to 72 hours, we will send you over a, the code. And, you're in a, being in a business, you're just like, oh, please, I hope they sent that. I need that receipt, because if they don't, then I lose the write-off. So it was very interesting to implement. I do think it was smart on the Mexican government's behalf, because it was their way of trying to assure they get paid every single peso they could from their population, because, I mean, it was rampant with fraud. It's a way that they cut fraud out of the tax, or at least I wouldn't say cut, because you can still do it, but now it's all digitally traced. You have transactions that are all digitally transacted. I mean, it's kind of like, if you put a transaction into gap compliant software in the US, to where, QuickBooks, you could just erase it. Oops, that never happened. Whereas something like an SAP Business One or Sage Intacct, you have that there, and you just can't do that because you had to actually put something to offset it. You're in the same situation there. So it really limited the fraud that could happen. And that's where I just don't get with the United States. It seems like we just don't have the buy-in, because people, oh, that's too hard, or they make excuses for it. But on the same token, I mean, if you look, as of January 1st, I believe the IRS will require Venmo, PayPal, digital services like that. If you receive $600 or more, you will get I think it's a 1099K or something like that, but you'll get tax documents starting next year. And they're saying, oh, well, that's not because we're trying to, tax money that shouldn't be taxed. It's to make sure that we get every dime that we're supposed to get in the digital age. So that's where I think we're kind of doing a shift towards that. But Mexico was much more hardcore. It was almost like overnight, hey, for January 1st or whatever that date was, bam, we're going digital, and this is the only thing that's going to be accepted. So get with it or pay the missing tax.
And my wonderment there also is, did the government help those small businesses? Did they invest with them, for the material and the technology required in order to produce that? Or was it just you have to, and so you have to make these investments? What helped them to make that transition?
That's the thing. I'm sure that they had some people, that some areas that they did it. Just like the United States has programs for minority businesses or for low income type businesses, stuff like that, they would have that down there. In Mexico, there are forms of that. So I'm pretty sure that they probably had some of that education. I mean, I was lucky because one of my clients at the time made me use their accountant. And I was like, okay, I'll use your accountant, but then that means you're paying for, him. And they ended up paying for him. So I really didn't have to worry about it too much because it was kind of like, okay, power of attorney, blah, 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 and then they just deal with everything for me. But I don't think, I know from the amount of complaints that they had, they made some services available as far as seminars, speeches, stuff like that, some information online. But I mean, it really forced a lot of Mexicans, I think, at least in the beginning, to go out and get help from actual real accountants down there, which ended up costing them some money, some headaches, and I'm sure that a lot of people lost some precious tax write-offs those first couple years. I think it's stabilized now though to where everybody's used to it, and they've probably tweaked things good enough to where it's more standard operating procedure than the disruptor that it was before.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with the entire with software, ERP software, all Mexico invoices are electronic, right?
Yep.
So there some requirements actually in conducting business that we don't have in the United States, for sure. So David, you have you moved, you got it from Mexico, then you came kind of into the LA area. You went to work for Vision33 at that point in time. And so what would you see as being, let's say that, I'm not sure if you did, but if you were to sell an ERP system in Mexico, as opposed to selling an ERP system in Los Angeles, right? What changes in that process? And, maybe it changes for other business, opportunities, unlike ERP in the same kind of way.
Yeah. So with me, basically, I did not sell ERP directly, but I did sell technological solutions. For example, there was the visitor's permit that you get when you go into Mexico. I sold the initial carnation of that to the Mexican federal government. Fishing permits online, things like that were part of the contracts that I've held. And the sales process, it's very, very different than the American sales process, because in the States, we want instant gratification. We want the sale now. But if you're a consumer, it's like, okay, I want to buy the software. I want the software now. So it's kind of like a win-win, the sales rep wins, well, not that in Mexico. It's very, very drawn out. And I think initially my first couple years down there, because you got to remember, it was my first about 2001 maybe to 2008, 2009, no, 2010, okay, is when I ended up kind of really going on my own down there. So my first 8-9 years, I was living in Mexico and I was working in San Diego. Now, when the economy really tanked and went downhill, I'll be honest, I couldn't find the job in San Diego that I felt that we, could live off of, that I felt paid me wages that I felt was worth my time. So I ended up finding contracts for businesses that they're like, hey, we have a lot of product to sell, but it's not selling as good as we'd like in the US. What about maybe going down south into Tijuana and Mexico or South America? So I've made enough contacts over the past 8 years that it allowed me to kind of expand into Central and South America. And because of that, it gave me the exposure of holding some contracts for some companies and working down there. I was trying to sell to two people. One, I'd be selling to the Mexican government. Okay, well, different level. So the state of Baja California, as well as the Mexican federal government. And then I'd also be selling to Mexican corporations too. And selling to both of them, for the most part, it was, especially in the beginning, it was so frustrating for me as an American, because I'm used to going in, closing, getting the deal. And then, for the most part, if a customer's like, yeah, I'll get back to you by the end of the week, they get back to you by the end of the week. None of that. I mean, if the customer's telling you things like, hey, I'll get to you in 5 minutes, I'll call you back by the end of the day, let's just say they say, realistically, that probably means I'll call you back in a month. The timelines are so elongated down there. And I think if you're an American or someone that's only sold in America and you've got our styles down, that's something you really have to prepare for. It is very hard to get a quick win in Mexico. I mean, you can get lucky. I mean, maybe you have pre-established relationships or whatever that's been for a while. You can always get lucky. I mean, there's always going to be a bluebird that'll just pop in for you at the last second. But for the most part, the majority of the rule is that it is going to take a lot longer, especially if you're doing a big tech system. And I felt like they always are negotiating, and they're always negotiating more. I think maybe this was a little bit more with the Mexican government, but also corporations, because until they sign on the dotted line, even if they kind of already have an agreement with you, it's kind of like they're still trying to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And, it's just a long, drawn out process. Something that might take me 4 months to sell in the US might take me, anywhere from 6 to 10 months to sell down in Mexico. It's just different. I mean, even simpler things as far as website advertisements, things like that. I had that even was a much, you're talking about spending $50, a month for 3 months. I mean, that's usually a quick business decision for most businesses up here. Down there, I mean, even it's a slower process. And I think some of that is because, unlike the United States, where everything's kind of decentralized in a way, down there, everything goes through Mexico City. And I think people need to realize that, or they'll oftentimes forget because they're in Tijuana or they're in Monterrey or Guadalajara or any one of those other larger Mexican cities. But, for most companies, I mean, or the governments, that's all still got to go routed through Mexico City for an approval, and that adds time to it as well.
Interesting. I mean, would you say, I mean, it sounds like, and maybe it is just because of that centralization, but it also feels like, David, that there's just less of a sense of urgency about a lot of things culturally.
Yeah, I would definitely say, even when they say that there's a sense of urgency, there's not a real urgency behind it. They need it now, but now to them could be 3 years.
Yeah.
And that just kind of, to be honest, I don't truly get it. To this day, I still don't get the thinking behind all of that. And I have a Mexican son and my wife's Peruvian, and that's a little bit of the same mentality there. And believe me, I mean, if I could figure that out, I'd have the perfect marriage. But yeah, it does get a little bit frustrating, and the centralization of it. I mean, even Peru, I mean, you're talking selling big major companies. Maybe you need to sell something out there that'll be in Trujillo, for example, up in a more northern area of Peru. But that's where you're meeting with the directors or the managers, and they're the decision makers, the quote unquote decision makers. But yet their decisions got to go through this bureaucratic process that happens between Trujillo and somebody down in Lima, Peru. And it's the same way in Mexico City, where it's, okay, you're buying off of, now if the company's only in Tijuana, then you're usually good. But most companies are going to be, major companies in Mexico are going to probably be based out of Mexico City. And I think that was one of the more frustrating things when you're trying to work with some of these big companies, or even medium-sized companies. Maybe they are based out of Tijuana, but the owner of the company is actually based down in Mexico City, you know? So it's kind of like the same thing. Okay, it goes through that centralized process. And that always threw me like a curveball. Like, how are you going to let someone make a decision that is just reading your reports and your analysis and stuff like that has nothing else to do, and then just determines on paper yes or no, are we going to go with your recommendation or not? Because that's really what they're saying. And that was one of the hardest things, I think, for me to really work with and figure out.
Interesting. You know, it's both of us know for a fact that it's easier to sell to somebody who's a referral.
Oh
But
yeah.
kind of cross the border with me now. And how much does the referral mean in California as opposed to what it meant in Mexico?
Um, I think down in Mexico, the referral meant a lot. In fact, I worked for the Mexican government for 2 years. I was the binational advisor to the Secretary of Tourism. And I am one of the only white guys you'll find that has a letter of recommendation from the Mexican government. And that's one of my bucket list items. I have that. In fact, when I interviewed with Vision 33, that was with my resume, like right there. Take that. That means something to me. But with that, I use that paper down there too. The declaration, as far as the Mexican government didn't pay me much, and it was a part-time gig at the time. So I would use that to kind of open the doors, or I'd use my contacts down there as far as with the Mexican government, like, hey, Carlos, can you get me a call with this company or whatever. And that's kind of how things work down there. I mean, up here you may say, well, that sounds a little shady, David, but down there it's part of how business was done at the time. That's culturally acceptable, and that's why I had engaged with it. But having like a referral like that was critical down there, especially being a foreigner. A lot of people have the mentality that, Americans that come down here and they'll use us or burn us and then, take our money and run. And having that level of trust down there was very important to get the engagement, to get people to really give that warm and fuzzies up front, so that the people that you're dealing with kind of trust you, like, okay, this dude's serious. They're not going to burn me. They're going to take care of me. And I think that whether it's in California or whether it's in Mexico, both are very important as far as referrals. But I kind of lean on down in Mexico. It was kind of more critical for my success. And that, I think, is because of the sales cycle, the being a foreigner part, stuff like that, to where if I didn't have all the references or the referrals that I did, be it from Mexican government or for another one of my business friends or whatever it was, I don't think the doors would have been open for me to be as successful as I was down there.
Interesting. So come from Pottsville, right?
Yep.
In Pennsylvania.
Call me Yingling.
Yeah. Most people don't know that Yuengling is the oldest brewery in the United States and still very active, even though I'm not sure it's made its way over the Rocky Mountains yet.
They just announced a partnership with somebody that it's going to be in all 50 states now as part of, I forget if it was like Coors or if it was Budweiser, but I believe both of those are owned by foreign companies. But and I think Yuengling is probably the number 1 or number 2 American owned beer right now.
Interesting. So, and you're out in LA now, for Mexico, LA for a few years, and then you take over a region in the Northwest, your office is located in Philadelphia.
Northeast. Yes.
Northeast. Yeah. So you have that whole region. So what's changed, right? Moving from West Coast to the East Coast into the Northeast. What part of the legend about Philadelphia and New York and Boston is true, and what's not so true?
So I'm originally from out here, but you got to remember, as we discussed earlier, most of my adult life, I lived out in Mexico or in Southern California. In fact, I'm 38 now. I mean, it's probably, yeah, been roughly about 20 years with about 15, 16, years or so, 15, 16 years out there in Mexico. And with that being said, I didn't have much sales experience per se in the Northeast up until I moved back here. Coincidentally, I ended up moving to Los Angeles because of Vision 33. And it was kind of like one day I'm talking with one of the co-founders and the VP of America, and he was just kind of like, "Hey, David, you want to move back home?" I was like, not really, but why? He's like, "Oh, we want you to do what you did here in LA, getting these accounts, duplicate that in the Northeast. We need to grow the Northeast." So I wasn't thrilled with going back home because I did love LA. I did love Mexico. I mean, even when I was living in LA for 3 years or whatever it was, I mean, we'd be heading down to Tijuana once, twice a month on the weekends and stuff because that culture just became a part of me. It's part of my identity of who I am, and I love it. And I miss it down there now that we've been up here in Philly. But business is definitely different. And I think, you just can't put all of the West Coast into a basket. I think that's one thing too many people do. They'll think that San Francisco culturally is going to probably be like the same as Los Angeles or San Diego. And I'll tell you, all three of them are totally different, but they keep lumping it together. Oh, California, style versus really, really different. I would say even in SoCal, the differences between San Diego and LA are very, very different. And that's because you have like the I like to call it the border zone there, the border, Orange County, right between both of them as a buffer. And, San Diego, you go to the office, you bring your dog, you wear flip-flops, you wear sandals, and everything's cool. You don't see too much of it to that degree in a place like Los Angeles. You don't see none of that at all. People don't even think about it between Philly, Boston, New York. And I think that's probably one of the bigger differences is that more formal out here, I tend to find, it is going to be a little bit more formal. I find myself writing. I looked at a lot of my old emails and I would see out there, I would usually write like, "Hey, Carl," to open up an email. And I still do this to everybody I know, but to clients too, or prospects. And they'd write back, "Hey, Dave, hey, David, very super casual." Even in LA, I look now and up here, everybody's like, "Hello, sir." And it is a big difference. And I think even negotiating the sales cycle is different as well too. And some specifics is my sales rep, love of Chris Jennings. He basically is always like, "Oh yeah, these people in New York, they negotiate software like they do a pound of sugar." And it is like that. I think that they're more hard line as far as wanting discounts, trying to get lower prices. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because everything else is so expensive. They're just used to trying to save on these things as much as they can, or just because they feel that the price is inflated and they can get it down. But there's a much harder stance with them in New York compared to places like LA or San Diego or Mexico.
Yeah, you wonder if if the kind of bartering, mentality is just, more into the culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of just
that word, the B word there, bartering. That is something that I didn't mention about Mexico, but yes, that's something that you'll see in Mexico, but you won't see as much in San Diego or LA. That's one thing I did forget up until you just rang my buzzard right there. down there in Mexico, they would be negotiating, well, he said that they would be negotiating, but they'd also have that bartering there that like they would want to do a lot of trade-offs. So let's just say you're selling something and it's $1,000 per month. And let's just say they have a service that's $200 a month. So they're like, okay, you know, as part of this deal, we're going to give you the service for free and we're going to pay you $800 a month. You know, they call those intercambios, exchanges. But that is how it is to a degree. It feels negotiating with a lot of these businesses in Philly, in New York City, in Boston, not so much in the suburbs, but in the actual cities themselves.
Yeah, interesting. You know, you probably don't know that I spent 3 years in Puerto Rico as a boy. And,
there you go.
My mother used to shop a lot at the market, the open market. And I couldn't speak Spanish because my grade in school was the third grade and it was all English speaking. But my brother went into the Spanish speaking second grade class and he learned to speak Spanish fluently within about 6 months. So he would always go with my mother to the market, right, and do all the haggling for her, right, through the whole experience. So it was very important to the culture that, you know, nothing, you don't buy anything, you know, for the price it's stated at, right?
Yeah.
It's more like that now. I visited subsequently and it's more like, you know, a normal sort of US experience, but there's still that element in kind of like a fruit market or a food market, you know, outdoors, you know, in a smaller place.
Or the borderline down there in Tijuana, San Ysidro, enter you're waiting in line in your cars. And for people that have not been there, it's just full of vendors of anything that has been made to mankind. You can buy right there in that borderline at whatever price they come at you with. Like if say $10, automatically offer them like 20%. And you're probably going to get it for 60 to 70% off when it's all said and done. You know, it's just bartering. Now, bartering only goes to a certain degree, though. And I think that goes to, like, you can't go to a taco stand down in Mexico and barter the prices, you know, or a restaurant or things. So those things, people don't barter. But if you're going to a tourist area, things like that, that's where I think they barter because they think, I think they think that Americans like to barter and that they're going to try to get the price down. So it's kind of like a reverse psychology thing, but I don't know. But you do see it down there and you do see a lot of bartering and trade-offs in business.
Yeah, I bought my first guitar in Tijuana. At a place just like that. Yeah, I think it started out at like $100 and ended up paying $40 for it or something like that.
Wow. So, I want to hear your Tijuana stories, Carl.
that was the only one I can recall, actually. Well, one when I was older and after I was married, but that was to go to a specialty medical clinic actually in Tijuana. So
they have a lot of those. One of my best friends, his wife is a dentist, and you know, for many years, we didn't even have to get the dental plan with Tijuana, with Vision33, because, you know, we're going down to Tijuana once a month. So I would just drive down there. I'd hit her up and, you know, she would charge me $20 for a cavity. A normal American, I think she's charging 3-4 times more. But for me, it's like, hey, just give me $20. I mean, she's known me since I moved down there. You know, $20 cleaning, everything. Just give her a $20 bill and she does it for me. So we kind of had our own little dental system there with our personal friend. But even my wife's braces, my wife got braces for free because it was part of a software deal I sold out of Mexico. That's how much we've bartered. I mean, come on. She got free braces from an orthodontist that was a part of a software website as well as a website advertisement deal that we did for 3 years. So that is probably the best example I could give you about bartering in Mexico.
Very interesting, for sure. Well, David, this has been a lot of fun, man. We don't get to talk very often anymore, and appreciate it. One of these days, we'll get to catch up on that Yingling topic, and for sure,
definitely,
definitely.
And, thank you so much for having me on, Carl.
Absolutely, and for everyone else, we'll see you again. Until the meantime, please stay connected.